Hi, this is Elisheva Bat Yisrael, and I am presenting today on dining etiquette in the Ottoman Empire. This is in part in preparation for our plausibly period feast, Ottoman, where we are targeting the middle of the 1500s, right at Suleiman the Magnificent's reign. So in preparation for our event, we thought we would share about what would be expected within this time period and place. So first, let's kind of set the stage for the wider Islamic world. It wasn't just the Ottomans at this point in time and history. The Islamic world really covered a very broad range of geographic regions, from a good portion of Africa through the Middle East and into the Caucasus regions, and as far east as India. And we really see this playing out in pictures, miniatures, literature from across these different regions, where they're all participating in Islamic world culture when it comes to how one eats. So the table manners, we have some consistent features about how one would eat within this world. So we have examples like from India, as well as examples from Iran, Persia, and North Africa with Cairo, where we can see pretty consistently folks are seated on the floor, so sitting on some sumptuous rugs or maybe on a low platform. This is more common for like the kings or sultans that were high nobility, that they would be allowed to be raised above on this little platform. But mostly people were sitting as though they were sitting on the floor, like cross-legged or kneeling. And you would eat around communal shared dishes. So because you're on the floor, you would have like a leather dining mat laid out, or it's something that would kind of delineate the floor space as your dining space, and then dishes would be placed down on that mat in front of you, and you would share these dishes with all of the people sitting around you. So it's family style meals. No one has an individual plate in front of them. You are eating with your hand, primarily the right hand, is what is outlined by Islam, that's the hand that you should eat with. And you would be eating with primarily the first three fingers, the thumb, the forefinger, and their middle finger, in order to take morsels of food from those communal shared dishes. You would also have flatbread or bread of some kind, but usually it's a form of flatbread that you could use as a scooping mechanism. So in the lower right-hand corner, we see in this image from Iran in 1485 to 1495, those like little beigeish, brownish circles all the way around the edge of that dining mat. That was bread. So that was bread that would be laid out at the beginning of the meal and would be left there throughout the meal, no matter how many dishes were replaced for, new courses to be brought out or new dishes to be brought out to your dining area. You would have that bread next to you that you could like tear off pieces of and then use that bread as a scooping mechanism for eating. In the lower left-hand corner, there's an example of an extant sukurdan tray from Mamluk Egypt in the 14th century. So this is an example of like a tray that was designed for this kind of communal sharing, but this is specifically like a snacky tray. So you have those little spots in the tray that are specifically for like each different kind of snack or pickle or side salad that you would have available, and then everyone around the table would share and like take as they pleased from those little dishes. And then kind of along with this, we have some very strong courtesy culture throughout the Islamic world within period throughout the centuries. So the Ibn Sayyar al-Warraq cookbook, which has been translated by Nawal Nasrallah as Annals of the Caliph's Kitchens, highly recommend this book. There are so many great recipes in there. But interestingly, at the back of his text, he has a few chapters devoted to how to be be a boon companion, how to be a good companion to the caliph, and what was expected of a proper, gentle gentleman of the time period from the perspective of etiquette and courtesy. We also have God's Banquet by Van Gelder is a really great compilation and commentary on food within Arabic literature. So looking at themes of food and how food kind of interrelates and is presented throughout different kinds of literature from period. Some really great stories there. And al-Baghdadi was a contemporary within the period, a really well-known scholar, and he has a treatise of, he was mostly known as like a very serious Islamic scholar, but he also has this treatise on party crashing. It's been translated by Emily Seelove, and this is a fantastic book, highly recommend it. So many really hilarious stories. And from these sources, like a lot of these sources are really emphasizing these consistent values of the culture from this time and today as well. So things like that the host should be generous. So the host should be generous, should be offering his food openly for anyone and everyone, should be encouraging his guests to eat. If he sees that somebody is like shy or like not quite comfortable, he should be encouraging them. He should, offer very nice choice pieces of food or meat to his guests. And like one of the stories actually that really tells this virtue very clearly and was kind of startling to me when I read it, is a story about a man kind of head of his little family and, with his herds of animals, and that he was always throwing these really big banquets. He was offering everyone in the town to come eat. And so he was going through his herd. He was slaughtering his animals very quickly in order to throw these large banquets and give so generously to the wider community. And his son kind of stepped up and said, like, Dad, you can't do this. We're going bankrupt. Like, we're about to go bankrupt. You cannot keep offering all of this food to everyone. Like, we can't keep killing our animals. We won't be able to survive. And for me, as a modern Westerner, my perspective is like, yeah, absolutely. Like, listen to your kid, right? Like, don't be silly here. But the perspective and the moral of the story in period is not that the son is right. It's in fact that the father is right. So the father is the virtuous one in this story, and the son is being held up as an example of what not to do. So he is held up as an example of someone who is not virtuous within this context. So the emphasis on generosity is that you should be so generous that you would absolutely bankrupt yourself before being in any way stingy with your resources. However, on the flip side, you also, in order to have this culture of generosity, you also need to have a culture of respect on the part of the guests. So guests should be considerate of their host. They should not be gluttonous. They should not be eating more than they really need to. They should not be party crashing and inviting themselves to parties that they weren't explicitly invited to. But there's also the balance between the host being generous and the guests being not gluttonous. The emphasis is definitely on the host, that it's a worse sin from reading these stories and the way that they're presented. A lot of times the stories about the guests who are kind of party crashing or, being a little gluttonous or something, often those stories are told in a very joking tone, whereas the stories that involve a host who's not being generous and who's being stingy, the way those characters are treated, the way that the author is clearly viewing those characters, it is the worst. So if you have to, sin or break one of these, then you would break on the side of the guest and not break on the side of the host. So you should be, absolutely be paying attention to this generosity. But of course, humans are humans, and I think everyone also understands when the host in a story is, very frustrated with his gluttonous guests. So there's a fair amount of like sympathy also in that, from that respect. One of the other things that is emphasized very strongly is cleanliness. So cleanliness is a very big part of Islamic culture. People are expected to be washing several times a day, and certainly before the meal, there is an emphasis on washing oneself, washing one's hands. There's a whole hand washing ceremony. Really, you're supposed to be washing not just your hands and under your fingernails, but also washing your face, combing your beard, and perfuming yourself. You're expected to contribute to the pleasant atmosphere of the entire dining experience by arriving in clean, unsoiled clothes that have been not just washed, but also perfumed with pleasant odors. And many of the cookbooks of this period throughout these different regions have recipes in there for different perfumes, different washing powders, different incenses. So there's these explicit recipes for how to make these things because there's an expectation that people are using them on a regular basis and that they're specifically using them in relation to the dining experience. Another thing that we kind of see and that I thought was a fun note is that the notion, kind of along with the notion of not being gluttonous as a guest and being considerate, is also this recurring theme of being kind of controlling one's body. And so like asceticism is seen as like a pretty virtuous trend. So it's hand in hand with not being gluttonous, that you should eat calmly, not too quickly, that you shouldn't eat too much, that you shouldn't be, overeating. But also this manifests as a form of veganism that shows up in period within this cultural context. So there are learned men who are praised for being incredibly virtuous, and they are writing about not eating meat and only eating vegetables, and that this is part of someone who is virtuously like controlling gluttony and kind of not falling prey to that. So some interesting in-period examples of veganism purely from the perspective of virtue and of like sparing the animals, things like that. So very fun stuff. Within this context, now we have the specificity of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire at this point in time, like as Suleiman was stepping up into his reign, it was already pretty expansive. His father had conquered Egypt. So we have like Cairo and the Upper Nile being part of the Ottoman Empire, as well as Mecca, and then this, part of Algeria up here on the top on the northern bit of Africa. And then Suleiman himself also expanded the borders even further, kind of connecting up those pieces of North Africa so that it was continuous across the Mediterranean Sea there. And then also pushing pretty far north up into Europe, into Austria and Hungary. So we have, even within the Ottoman Empire, we have a pretty expansive geographical region that again is inheriting and still participating in all of those pieces of Islamic dining culture in general, but they have some particularities that we start to see that become very Ottoman in nature. So one of those is spoons. So we talked about hands, like eating with one's fingers and eating with one's hands. That was still very much a thing, but the Ottomans also started using spoons and they became very popular. In the 14th century, they were still considered like unhygienic to use spoons, and there's later instances of Ottomans in like the 18th and 19th century, when they're exposed to the European practice of using forks and knives, that they similarly thought of that cutlery as being unhygienic, because the notion is, well, I don't know how well they washed that spoon or that fork, like I don't know where that's been. But my hands, I've washed just before I came down to, just before I sat down at this meal. So I know exactly how clean my hands are. I don't know what's going on with that cutlery over there that all of you Europeans are using. And kind of similarly with spoons, The Ottomans did use spoons, especially with it becoming more common in the 16th and 17th centuries, but each person would have their own. So they would bring their own spoon with them. Similarly, people would have their own knife with them. So if they needed to, say, like cut a joint of meat off of a larger roast, they would use their own knife for that. And we have some really beautiful examples of these 16th century spoons from the Ottoman Empire. Absolutely gorgeous. And they would be used for eating maybe a bit of pilaf, certainly soups. The Ottomans were very big fans of soup. And of course, you cannot eat soup even just with a piece of bread. You need a spoon for that. And later on in period, we also have lots of examples, or later on in period and then post-period, actually, we see lots of examples of spoons being presented with sherbet. So sherbet is also something that was very popular within the Ottoman Empire. So it's a sweet drink that would be served over ice or over shaved snow. So in the lower left-hand corner, we have a sherbet stall, a vendor selling sherbet in the marketplace in 1582 is where that painting comes from. And in the very bottom, it's kind of cut off, but in the very bottom you can see this like white blocky rectangle there. That is actually a block of packed snow that they would then, shave pieces off of to cool the sherbet down. And so you'd be presented at a banquet or a fancy meal at the palace. You'd be presented with sherbet in little individual cups, and they would come with spoons that you could use to help eat the sherbet. Coffee also became popularized during Suleiman the Magnificent's reign. One of his pashas, who had been stationed in Yemen, became exposed to the drink and then brought this back to the court and the wider Ottoman Empire. It spread like wildfire, coffee houses popping up everywhere, and people absolutely loved it. And so the first instances of coffee and coffee cups that we have and how people would be drinking their coffee was not actually with the little kind of espresso-like cups with maybe a tiny little handle and a saucer that we're so familiar with today from Turkish coffee. But if you look closely at the coffee house scene here from 1620, everyone is using these handleless cups, these tiny little, they're still small, but they're more bowl-like, and it's much more likely that these were Chinese small bowls that were imported into the Ottoman Empire from China. The Ottomans were a huge fan of Chinese porcelain and ceramics. It was an absolute thing to have Chinese ceramics and tableware for their plates and bowls, pitchers, and these little small cups or small bowls that were then used as cups. The Chinese ceramics became the inspiration for the Turkish İznik pottery that then exploded into its own industry. But within our period, within Suleiman the Magnificent's reign that we're really focusing on here, those Chinese porcelain pieces were absolutely prized and hugely popular. So along with some of the kind of new items that are very Ottoman items that were very popular from a food and dining perspective, we also have an Ottoman treatise on table manners. So we're not only relying on the older 10th century instructions for how to be a good boon companion, but we also have a treatise on the etiquette of social dining from the scholar Muhammad Badr al-Din al-Ghazi. And al-Ghazi was a well-known Ottoman scholar at the time. He was educated in Cairo and then lived in Damascus and wrote lots of very well-respected pieces. But his notes on social dining read like a what not to do. So there's a long list of pretty evocative names that he calls people who do these things. And you'll start, as we go through them, I think you'll also start to see those themes of generosity and gluttony or anti-gluttony kind of coming out in these criticisms that he had of people when it comes to dining as well. So the crawler is someone who crawls out onto the table. table in quotes because at this point in time we are eating on the floor for the most part, so eating on a dining mat. And this is, again, it's a lot harder to crawl out on top of a table that is raised, but certainly when it is functionally part of the floor and part of the ground, then this crawler name makes a lot more sense. So somebody who crawls out onto the table before others, or maybe before the food is like fully laid out, this would be a no-no. So if you see a server bring one of the dishes down and it's like over on the other side, like, don't be so eager to eat that you crawl out across the table to take food before everything is really set up yet. The dilatory is one who is late, so don't be late to your dining experience or your dining party, because that would be rude to the guest. The grunter, the smacker, the finger licker are fairly self-explanatory. The stretcher, kind of similar to the crawler, is somebody who is like stretching or reaching across to eat and take from a platter that's far away from him. The stomach turner is speaking of things that nauseate his fellows, so don't talk about things that are unpleasant or disgusting. The camel neck is someone who stretches his neck around to not drop on his clothes from the food that he's eating, instead dripping on like the table and the tablecloth. So we see that theme of cleanliness come up again, where you are supposed to be clean, you are supposed to also maintain your clothing and make sure that everything is still clean and neat, but that means that you shouldn't be doing all of these kind of neck gymnastics in order to try and avoid dripping and things. The terminator is someone who eats everything on the platter, leaving nothing but bones. So this is, again, an anti-gluttony kind of statement. Don't eat everything that's there. It's also indicative of the practice that they would have of taking the platters. So you would bring a dish out, bring several dishes out, and you would have many, many dishes, one after the other. So we have some instances where there's like a single communal dish that's brought out, particularly for a small table. You don't have a lot of space, so you would bring these out one at a time. If you have a much larger table, then maybe you're going to have several dishes out on the table at once. But regardless, the sheer number of dishes that were served at these banquets and dining halls it was vast, far more than Europeans were expecting, certainly. So there are counts of 20, 30, 40 dishes being served. That means that the servers are, bringing some food out. They're bringing a dish out, leaving it for a little bit, and so people are taking like a few bites as they go. And then the servers are taking that dish away, and they take it back to the kitchens, to the back, and then the servers and the kitchen staff and other people can then eat from that same platter, that same dish. So again, somebody who's like, it's the don't eat everything on the platter, also because that's rude, because part of the custom is that other people are going to eat from that same platter after you've had a few bites yourself. The setter is someone who, quote unquote, volunteers to set dishes on the table, but they're not really doing this just to be helpful. They're actually doing it to see what tasty dishes there are and to place the ones that he wants the most closest to himself. So don't be that guy either. Similarly, the meddlesome is someone who's kind of jumping in and maybe appearing to be considerate to other guests because they're like, oh, I'll rip off, some pieces of the roast for you and for you and for you. Or he's like jumping the gun to kind of break the bread and place it on the table. So like jumping in and doing things to other people's food is not considerate. It's not done. This also includes people who are, so quote unquote considerate as to improve the dish that's been laid out by putting salt or spices on top of the communal dish and into the communal dish. This is absolutely a no-no. There were salt cellars. They're available on the table, just like there were other condiments or maybe spice mixes. There would be herbed and flavored vinegars available. So if you wanted to enhance your bite of whatever dish you were taking, then you had that available to you, but you were expected to do that only to your bite that you were going to take and put in your own mouth. You should not be salting or doing additional seasoning to the communal dish, because this is for other people too. The glutton and the racer, these are people who are constantly stuffing their face. The racer is somebody who has food in his mouth and is still chewing, and then at the same time is like grabbing food to have in his hand. So he has the next morsel ready to go, ready to stuff in his face the minute he's done chewing. It's all part of the same thing. Don't be so eager, don't be so hungry and starving that you are, stuffing your face willy-nilly like this. Same thing, the heedless is someone who doesn't care what he's eating. He's not being careful, he's not being watchful, and so he's constantly choking on bones or on pits or, these other things. The roast and the food that was served in period, and this is true within Europe as well, was often not boneless and prepared the way that we do today, but was served more whole. So there were bones present in the fish. There were bones in the meats, the animals that were roasted and cooked up and served. So you did need to keep an eye out. But if you were being so gluttonous and so heedless of what you're putting in your mouth, then you would choke on things. This was not good. The praiser, someone who loudly praises the Almighty in the middle of eating, which then passive-aggressively tells everyone else that they should stop eating. So this was also not done. And it's kind of a nuanced critique there, because on the one hand, you might think that someone who is so transported by the food and how wonderful this is, that they are moved to thank God for the wonderful meal that's there, that you would think that this might be a good thing, but there in fact is no, you need to be considerate of the other people sitting down at the table, and if you are being so loud and vociferous about this, you could be making them uncomfortable and making them feel like, oh, it's time to stop eating, we're now gonna to enter prayer instead. So it's interesting is don't do that. Don't be that guy either. You want everyone to feel comfortable at the meal. The spewer is someone who laughs with food in his mouth, and so food and spittle go flying everywhere. The bovine sticks his tongue out like a cow to lick his lips. Don't do that. The divider, someone who pushes aside different pieces of food or meat to hide them from fellow guests so that they don't see it and they don't take that morsel because you really wanted it. And this notion of dividing the food that's on the communal plate, it's interesting because it also speaks to the notion of hygiene and how hygiene functionally works when you have a communal dish. So if you have a smaller table and you have a large communal dish in front of you with the food, and you're eating with your fingers, right? There is an expectation that, if you are careful, you're only taking from the part of the dish and the food that's right in front of you, and your neighbor is also taking just from what's in front of him, and their neighbor is taking only from what's in front of them, right? So that you're not kind of similar to some of the other things, don't reach across the table, don't reach across in front of your neighbor to the food that's right in front of them. Just take what's in front of you, whether that is a single dish that you could kind of imagine these pie slices of appropriate geography, the appropriate region of the plate to take from. You can imagine it that way when you have a single shared communal dish, or if you have multiple dishes because it's a much larger table, the same thing applies, right? That you don't want to reach in front of other people. And here, this notion of like the divider, somebody who's specifically dividing the food up onto the plate, they're doing so not for hygienic reasons. They're doing so because they're wanting to kind of steal food for themselves and prevent other people from taking their pieces that they really want. So it's the don't do that, because that's where that's coming from. The disgorger is someone who becomes full but then goes and vomits in order to come back and eat some more. So it's the don't do that. Don't be a Hunger Games noble and be a disgorger. The grumbler, this is a critique for the host who is maybe always complaining about the cost of living or apologizing to guests profusely because of his poverty. So this is a host who is being ungenerous and stingy and making other people feel like they should not be eating too much and feeling guilty for sitting at his table. So this is the grumbler. This is a like bad host kind of comment. The fidgeter, someone who's playing with their nails or their hair or their beard and, moving around and constantly touching their clothes and touching these different parts of themselves. So this is not just like making somebody uncomfortable by like movement and, fidgeting around and stuff, but could also be part of the emphasis on cleanliness too. The disgusting one is someone who smears their chin with grease because he has no control over mouth and hand, and everyone then sees the grease dripping from his face. So it's the be calm, careful, and also very clean about how you take food so that you're not dripping all over the place. You're not getting stuff on your face as well as not getting stuff on your clothes. The trickster, and I have a couple of trickster stories here, but the trickster that Al-Ghazi is pointing out in his treatise is someone who piles food in front of his neighbor to eat, which is kind of a like, oh, I'm being so considerate, but here, have this piece, have this food. But really they're doing it because they know that the neighbor is going to then protest and say, oh no, I cannot eat all of this, and is going to then like insist that person eat the food instead. So it's kind of this roundabout way of both like saving food for yourself and having a lot of food for yourself, but appearing to be considerate to other people. And this is a no-no. In one of al-Baghdadi's stories from that party crashing book, there's also a story of a similar trickster, someone who is like labeled as super annoying, who is eating dates. And as he eats dates, he takes the pits and he puts the pits in front of his neighbor. So it looks like at the end of their meal, it looks like his neighbor has eaten all of these dates. He's eaten so much. And then he exclaims over how gluttonous his neighbor is because look at how many dates he ate. And the comeback to this, that his neighbor, the erudite and kind of respected one in this story, then absolutely he like comes back with a comeback and with a rejoinder, and he says, well, I may have eaten a lot of dates, but I was not so gluttonous that I swallowed all the pits, because there were no pits in front of this guy who thought he was like playing this trick. So a funny story. There's also the compulsive cutter, someone who takes a bite and then lets the rest of the food fall back in the communal dish. So along the lines of double dipping, don't do it. It's gross. The gulper, someone who swallows without chewing. So we have these giant, great gulps. The soiler, this one is interesting. Someone who insists on drinking water during the meal instead of waiting until after, and then gets grease on the handle of the cup. Now, this one, super, super interesting because it tells us a lot about the context of eating and drinking in this period. So first, it tells us that you're not drinking water throughout the meal. This is somebody who insists on drinking water during the meal instead of waiting until after. So it tells us that it's more common to wait until after the meal to have your beverages. But that, of course, if you need, there is water available. And so there are going to be serving serving boys there serving people, and so you can always call and ask for some water to be brought to you at your seat, but then they would be pouring water and bringing you a cup of water to drink. But if there is this, if there's a critique here on not soiling the handle of the cup with your fingers, why would you not want to do that? You would not want to do that, not because this is an individual cup that only you are drinking from, because if it's an individual cup and you soil it for yourself, who cares, right? But if other people are drinking from this same water goblet, then this makes a lot more sense. And indeed, when we think about the custom of like alcoholic drinks, and when people would drink wine, which, by the way, within the context of Islam, the amount of alcohol that was consumed varied dramatically. It was not always teetotaling, but people would drink wine. But when they did have these like wine drinking parties, it was very common to pass that wine goblet around the table. So you would be sharing wine with other people from the same cup. And it appears from this commentary from Al-Ghazi that that was also expected for water. I will note that for our PPF event, we are not planning to recreate this particular bit because I don't want us to be sharing liquids, touching people's mouths and lips. So we will, in fact, have multiple cups available for use and be washing them frequently so that there's always a clean cup if you need to drink some water. Continuing with our list, the stingy host who serves legumes and vegetarian dishes for hours so that everyone is full by the time the meat arrives. So this is again speaking to this custom of bringing multiple dishes out, that this is going to be a long affair. No one is sitting down to eat for like 15 minutes or 20 minutes for your like main dinner. You are sitting down and you are spending a long time there. You are going to be eating a little bit at a time from many, many dishes. But as is natural, you're probably still going to be eating more from the earlier dishes than you are from the later dishes, just because of how our bodies work and how hunger works. So it would be considered stingy to then purposefully serve only vegetarian dishes, which are cheaper to produce and serve for people, than to, and then to save all of your like fancy meats and things for the end. That would be very stingy because you know that people are going to eat more from the vegetarian things and refrain, and then they're only going to eat a tiny bit of the meat at the end. So don't be a stingy host, don't be ungenerous, and don't do that. Next, we have a comment from Al-Ghazi about how many hands you're using. So as we mentioned before, within the Islamic tradition, you're supposed to use your right hand to eat, and only those first three fingers, your thumb, middle finger, and forefinger. But Al-Ghazi has this comment about not doing weird gymnastics with your hand in order to only touch the food with a single hand. That when it is necessary, just use both hands. So if you need to like break off a piece of bread, instead of trying to, prop up one piece with your bottom fingers and then pull with the other fingers in order to make to pull off a piece, he's like, that's silly. Just use two hands and break your bread. I was really amused to see this and hear this because in one of our previous experiments with this type of dining style, we had read about only using the right hand to eat and instructed our diners in this. And then they immediately ran into this very same problem of like, well, what do we do when we need to break a piece off with our food? Or like, what if we're trying to take some meat off of the bone or something? Like, how are we supposed to do that? And they ended up getting really creative and like working together with like each person only using one hand and trying to pull in order to like make pieces happen for each other. But Al-Ghazi is basically explicitly telling us, hey, don't do weird gymnastic stuff. Don't be silly. Like, if you need to use both hands, just do so. That's fine. One who eats the food while it is too hot and thus has to blow on it while it's still in their mouth. that's gross, just like the spewer. Like, don't do anything where you're going to be, sending your breath out onto the communal dishes and into the faces of your other diners. The temperature note is a good one. This was a lesson learned from one of the earlier experiments that I did with this style of dining, where we had people sitting around these communal dishes. And because you're eating with your hands, you also need to be careful about the temperature of the food, because when you're using a fork or something to carry the food, you can eat it while it's like fairly hot. But you can't always touch it with your fingers when it's that hot. So this was something that I needed to take into account as somebody who was making and serving the food, of like, I should be careful and like not bring something out immediately when it's like boiling hot, and like wait for it to like cool a little bit. But Al-Ghazi is also saying, hey, diners, you should also be aware of the temperature of the food. Don't grab for it while it is too hot. Like, wait, right? Like, control yourself a little bit, and wait until it is the proper temperature that you can both touch it with your fingers, but also when you place it into your mouth, that it's not going to be so hot that you're, blowing all over the place. The last couple, we have someone who's dipping his fatty meats into communal dishes and then leaving traces of it everywhere. So it's just continuing to be considerate in this communal family-style dining environment. And then the last one, someone who is too silent. And the reason here is that it's interpreted as grim determination to eat. So this is someone who is so silent that they are a glutton. So it's hand in hand with that anti-gluttony theme. So if you're too quiet and you're like too focused on only eating, then this is an indication that you're like just grim determination. So the note on silence and talking, this is an interesting one because we have competing commentary. So on the one hand, we have commentary from Ibn al-Warraq, from that 10th century Baghdad book, where there's multiple indications that, the host should be engaging his guests in pleasant conversation, encouraging them to eat and making them feel comfortable, and that the, boon companion should likewise be a good conversationalist. But there's also indications that there were some sultans or some caliphs or kings who really did not like talking. And so depending on where you were, that you should know to be like utterly silent. So I think in the 10th century Baghdad book, there was this comment about how if you're eating with a Persian king, that you should be utterly silent, that he did not want you to speak. But this seems to have not been the case necessarily everywhere. And it would change from, sultan to sultan or caliph to caliph, what their preferences were for their own dining environment. There were European visitors to the Ottoman Empire specifically who were commenting on how quiet it was and saying that it was absolutely silent. So we have Fynes Morrison in 1596, and then also Swedish ambassador Nicholas Roland in 1656. Both were visitors to the Ottoman Empire and noted how quiet it was, that it was either silent or low voices at the meal. But we have these comments from Al-Ghazi on, people who are too silent, or people like the stomach turner who are talking about things that are that are disgusting or that are going to make other people, feel ill. So it seems when we pay attention to the Ottoman source, it seems clear that people did speak, that there was conversation expected, but when we're listening to the European visitor commentary, they're saying, oh no, they're so quiet. So I think this is an indication of a disparity in volume, that in the European context, it would have been more common to have louder conversations, and in the Ottoman context, we're having conversations, but it is very low. So we have low murmuring voices so that, the entire room is not hearing your conversation. So that's part of our politeness here, but we are still having conversation. So these are all very good notes for us to prepare ourselves as we think about entering our PPF event and sitting down at an Ottoman table, an Ottoman dining mat or spread on the floor. So I am going to post the video as well as the keynote or the deck here in PDF form. And we have some references, several of those books that I mentioned earlier, which I highly recommend. They're really fun. There's some really great stories in there. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to see you at PPF Ottoman in Caid.